I would like to start by introducing our panel, which is truly a high-powered panel. So if people can find their seats. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order. First is Mary Cranston, in red. Mary is retired senior partner and past chair of Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw, and Pittman, as it was. She actually listened to her bio, because I actually teach her bio in the Hastings Leadership Academy for Women as like the perfect bio for who she is. When she was chair, she expanded the firm from a regional California base to an international platform with 2 large mergers and the addition of 7 offices. She grew the firm revenues from $224 million to $600 million. And while she was head of it, it was named one of the 3 law firms named in the top 100 companies for working women. Each one of these women has an amazing number of honors. I'll just tell you a few. Mary was named one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America and one of the 2 best law firm leaders in the United States while she was running Pillsbury. She now sits on 6 corporate boards. Second is Kelly at the end, Kelly Dermody. Kelly is a partner at Lieff Cabraser. She's head of the employment practice group. Lieff, of course, represents plaintiffs in class actions in employment, consumer matters, and other matters. She's done a lot of race-gender litigation on behalf, shall we say, of Wall Street firms, and recently has done a lot of litigation helping large firms in Silicon Valley think more clearly about anti-competitive practices. She was named California Attorney of the Year. She's been repeatedly listed in Best Lawyers and Super Lawyers and was 2014 Lawyer of the Year for Employment Law. Pat Gillette, smack in the middle, is an employment partner at Orrick, where she represents employers in employment matters. And I think probably the people at the table have met each other in a variety of enriching contexts.
We're still friends.
Pat was, for many years, head of Heller Ehrman's labor and employment practice, and she's been extraordinarily active on behalf of women lawyers. 3 years as commissioner on the ABA Commission on Women, chairs the San Francisco Bar Association's No Glass Ceiling initiative, and many other initiatives on behalf of women lawyers. Teresa Renaker, there, second to the last, is a partner at Lewis Feinberg, Renaker, and Jackson, who also represents plaintiffs in employment matters. Teresa actually intimidates all of the rest of us because her specialty is ERISA law, which is the law of pensions, which is really fascinating but very, very hard. She has been named Northern California super lawyer in employee benefits since 1907 and among the top 50 women lawyers in Northern California every year since 2008. Finally, my former colleague, Magistrate Judge Donna Ryu, and we welcome you back, Donna. It's always a delight. We were very happy and sad when she was appointed to the bench in 2010. While she was here, she served as clinical professor of law here at Hastings, and before that as associate director and associate professor of the Women's Employment Rights Clinic at Golden Gate. She was named California Lawyer of the Year in Employment Law and received the Asian American Bar Association's Joe Morozumi Award for Exceptional Legal Advocacy, as well as the Rudder Teaching Award when she was here at Hastings. So please join me in welcoming this very distinguished panel. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Teresa. 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 Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ter I'm going to talk to you for 15 minutes based on a book I actually just finished with my daughter. This book, I have worked on behalf of women for so many years, since before many of you were born. And I've focused largely on organizational change and institutional solutions. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, I said, you know what? When I started this work, only 15% of equity partners are women. And guess what percentage of equity partners are women today? 15%. So I decided, well, enough organizational change. I'm going to work on women's empowerment and individual strategies. And I was very lucky that my daughter agreed to write this book with me. 68% of women believe that gender bias exists. I just finished 127 interviews with very successful women where I described the 4 patterns of gender bias. This is a way that gender bias hasn't been talked about before. And I asked them, hey, any of that sound familiar? Every syllable, said one woman. One woman just burst into tears after I described the patterns. And here you see the percentages. They basically agree with a 68% number, but the type of gender bias differs in terms of how common it is. This is part of what we call the New Girls Network. I would really urge you to visit the website, send in questions if you have it. It is www.newgirlsnet.com. And so here are the 4 patterns. I'll talk about them one by one. There are technical names for all of this. This is basically based on a literature review of several hundred experimental social psychology studies. The first I call Prove It Again, and about 2/3 of the women had encountered it. It stems from the sense that if you think about the brilliant litigator, brilliant neuroscientist, brilliant investment banker, the automatic association of most people is of a fairly tall white man with graying hair. And women just don't seem to fit quite as well. And that is in the law, of course, because the past isn't dead. It's not even past, as I mentioned. 15% of equity partners are women as we sit here today. And if you had told me that when I started to do this work in the 80s, I would have told you were crazy. Because of this lack of fit, women have to provide just a little more evidence of competence than men in order to be seen as equally competent. And here is the study. Actually, there's an African-American saying you have to try twice as hard to get half as far. Ain't far from scientific truth. Here's how it plays out. First of all, men tend to be judged on their potential, women on their achievements. And I'm going to give you examples from the interviews from the law. A man's okay if he's perceived to have the potential to bring in clients. I was not. Yeah, you have the network, but you don't have the work. Another is that objective rules tend to be applied rigorously to women, but leniently to men. Another quote from the interviews, most of your clients are established clients of the firm, one woman was told when she was contesting her comp. But a male partner had been handed a pre-existing case that kept him going for years and years and years. And she said to me, I'm sorry, how is that different? So notice that how the objective requirement was applied differently. Men's and women's successes are coded very differently. This is called the he's skilled, she's lucky pattern. Men's successes tend to be attributed to stable internal causes, but not women's. Men's and women's mistakes also tend to be coded very differently. The woman's in charge of it all, and she's a hero. But then a cross-exam doesn't go as expected. How quickly do you take her hero robe off? And the answer was very quickly. Actually, one of the things that I hear repeated reports now as the legal profession contracts is that women partners who lose a client often get shown the door very, very quickly, or their comp plummets, whereas the men's, they're given a little more leeway. Now, I want to stress that I'm not going to be talking here about solutions. The solutions are to change the organizations so that this kind of implicit bias doesn't play out every single day. But they're not changing fast, and so women need strategies. And a lot of these strategies are also helpful for younger men, and I'm pleased to see younger men in the audience. So here are some prove-it-again strategies. If people aren't going to remember your successes as well, and they are going to remember your mistakes, you need to keep careful, real-time records of every nice thing that is said about you and every objective accomplishment. Remember Mary Cranston's bio. She had numbers there. Grew from 225 to 600 whatever. A very effective way for a woman, frankly, to brag. But you need to have when you keep your time, you also keep your accomplishments in real time. For senior women, if you see different standards being applied, it's very easy just to say very in a moderate tone, I think we've really come to an agreement on what's important for this position, so let's go back to the top of the pile and just make sure we've applied it consistently. You can do that without spending a lot of political points. This is a favorite of my daughter, Rachel. She calls it the stolen idea, where a woman says something and it's kind of ignored, and a man says something and it is brilliant. It's the same thing. So what do you say? Thanks for picking up that idea. Or, exactly, you understand what I'm thinking. The next step is, and then you say something else brilliant. Those are, and in our book we have lots of these strategies. So that's the prove it again. Here's the tightrope. This is called prescriptive bias. Technically, 3/4 of the women had encountered it. This emerges because high-level jobs are not only predominantly male, they're also coded masculine. So women have to behave in masculine ways in order to be seen as competent. But of course, if a woman is too masculine, then she tends to be seen as having lacking in social skills and not warm. And women are supposed to be warm. I eliminated that slide, but we know that. This is from MIT. To get ahead here, you have to be so aggressive. So if women are too aggressive, then they're ostracized. But if they're not aggressive enough, then you have to do twice the work. And that's what we call the tightrope. You see, women often have to choose between being liked but not respected. I call that the too feminine problem. Or respected but not liked. That's the too masculine problem. And again, I'm not calling these people too masculine, too feminine. I'm saying this is what the studies show. And I just talked to 130 people, and they're not just studies. Here are some too feminine problems. You've heard that women don't ask. Women tend not to negotiate as hard as men. You'll learn later why. I guess there's pushback if they do. But that's the way women are trained up, not to be quite put themselves forward. Women also find themselves doing the office housework. I was actually talking with somebody very high up in a company at breakfast this morning, and she said, oh yeah, office housework. I take the notes, I arrange the meetings. This person was number 3 below the CEO. Also, women tend to get assigned very narrowly cabined feminine roles. In a law firm, the big one is dutiful daughter. A lot of the Hastings Leadership Academy for Women, we say to these women, you got where you are as junior partners being the dutiful daughter. We're going to teach you how to lose the dutiful daughter, because at this point that has become a career-limiting strategy. Also, women in mixed groups. This doesn't happen when they're just with women, but women in mixed groups of men and women tend to use more tentative speech, that question mark at the end of a sentence, make fewer task suggestions, we should do this, and interrupt less than men. These are actually subordinated patterns that are characteristic of every subordinate group. On the other hand, if you're direct, outspoken, assertive, or competitive, then you may have these two masculine problems. So if you're stern or you say no, the immediate reaction is to call that woman a bitch, right? If you're a man, it's just a no. Anger is a big danger point for women. The studies show that showing anger increases a man's perceived status, but decreases the perceived status of a woman. Oh, well, that's him, one woman said to me. She was talking about a partner of hers who was kind of a screamer. But when a female colleague got irritated with her assistant and yelled at her, the interesting thing is that she was perceived as a bitch. Self-promotion, the studies show young people that you must engage in self-promotion. That's very important. On the other hand, women who engage in self-promotion often encounter pushback, actually even stronger from other women than from men, but strong from both. This is from the Leadership Academy. a woman had found out that one of her male partners, same data points, was getting like $200,000 a year more than she. She did exactly the right thing, went to a member of the comp committee and said, just as Mary would, I want to familiarize you. I brought in these clients. I grew this client from X and Y. And her partner looked at her and said, well, you think highly of yourself, don't you? Push back for self-promotion. Okay, so here are some individual strategies for the tightrope. It's really important, and the panel will talk more about this, to be authentic. You can't be who you aren't because it doesn't work. Also, why would you want to be? Really important. So it's a matter of fine-tuning who you are. I'm going to let Mary talk about how to handle office housework because the key strategy comes straight from her lips. Here is what's called power posing. And you should definitely go on to TED Talks and read and listen to Amy Cuddy's talk. If you stand like this for 2 minutes, literally the hormones that make you confident and commanding increase. If you stand like this, the opposite happens. So free choice, but I have a recommendation. In terms of speech patterns, this was a brilliant strategy of someone who works in Silicon Valley. She said, I can't get a word in edgewise when the men are talking. And her mentor said, wait, when he is almost done, you start to make your point, and if he doesn't stop, you just say, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done. She has behaved in a masculine way in a feminine tone. That's the formula. Should we have to do this? No. As McKinnon says, sometimes to survive in a system, you have to do exactly the opposite of what you have to do to change it. But a girl's got to do what a girl's got to do. The generic is to, I call it, stand your ground with softeners. And we talked, a lot of these women had different softeners. Showing empathy is the most obvious one because women are supposed to be high in warmth. So if you're being very authoritative in a very warm way, that tends to work. There are others as well. I've never been afraid to be gracious. This was a woman from the South. And I don't mean like smarmy gracious, but I mean actually to acknowledge in a very heartfelt way other people's contributions. She was also doing something else women are supposed to do, which is to be communal. In terms of ambivalence towards adopting some of these feminine strategies, wouldn't it actually be better if men did that too? So in terms of self-promotion, 2 strategies, power to the posse and praise your team. The posse is simply that when you're coming up, you have a posse of men and women, and you celebrate each other's accomplishments. Once you get more senior as a woman leader, you can praise your team. Again, doing something masculine, bragging in a feminine tone. For anger, it's very important to be able to get angry, but use it very rarely, very, very rarely. This is true of men or women. And here's the formula, straight from a study by Tori Breskel. If I look angry, it's because I am angry. And the reason that I'm angry is because you have jeopardized, insert shared business goal here. That's the formula. Here's the strongest pattern of gender bias. It's called the maternal wall. 60% of the mothers I interviewed had encountered it. This is the one actually that the center put on the map. It's an order of magnitude larger, as you see from the screen, than the glass ceiling bias I just talked about, and nobody was studying it before the center kicked that off. So people would say in pitch meetings, she has 4 children, as if she was a flying Walanda or something. And she would get very irritated. Why are you talking about my children? Why aren't you talking about my competence? On the other hand, mothers who are indisputably competent and committed are seen as less likable and held to higher performance standards. This is another tightrope. This is very, very common. It's called benevolent prescriptive bias. I don't know how you could leave your children. My wife could never do that. What's the message? So here are some strategies. When you come back from maternity leave, and there's actually it's called second child syndrome. Plaintiffs' employment lawyers know it well. Often when you come back from your second child, is when things get really interesting. If you intend to pursue your career, say so. If you're willing to travel, say so. If you're the primary earner, say so. In other words, counter bias with information. With respect to my wife could never do that, I call it the Tolstoy was wrong strategy. You know, I'm sure that's absolutely right for your family. But, you know, happy families are not all alike. This is what's right for mine. Shut up. No. The tug of war is when gender bias against women turns into fights among women. I want to point out that there are some people who didn't recognize any of these, and only 11% of people recognized all of them. And this is the least common. My women colleagues are very encouraging and very helpful and very kind. Doesn't always happen. Women are often very, very supportive of each other. On the other hand, there's specific reasons why women aren't. When there's gender bias in the environment, for example, in tokenism, opportunities for women here are very zero-sum, said one person. If one woman gets a prized position or assignment, that means another woman won't. So it breeds a sense of competition. This often is called the queen bee, as if this is a personality problem of an individual woman. This is just a woman being politically savvy in an environment shaped by gender bias, and that's typically what tug of war is. Also, some women, when we came up, it wasn't so easy. And so particularly women my age, sort of, it's a tough world out there. I got to toughen you up. You'll make us look bad, so I apply higher standards. I had to pay my dues. Again, gender bias against women sometimes turns into fights among them. One of the studies shows, or several show, that women who have encountered bias early in their careers, discrimination actually early in their careers, tend to distance themselves from other women. Why? It's the politically savvy thing to do. I call this the Marissa Meyer syndrome. I'm not a girl at Google, I'm a geek at Google. She's identifying with the in-group, not the out, just politically savvy thing to do. And then there are what I call fights between the femmes and the tomboys. I've seen lots of senior women behave that way. This was a more junior woman. Not only working long hours, but even adopting male mannerisms and being really aggressive, and also going out of their way not to mentor younger women. That's a younger woman femme looking up at an older woman my age tomboy. Here's a younger woman. I'm on kind of a backlash mission. I wear dresses, I bake cookies for my group meetings, I bring my child to class. I'm not going to compete as a boy, because I'm not a boy. Often this is a generational conflict, although not always. And you have the femmes and the tomboys at each other's throats, sometimes. Finally, mommy wars. Women's identities are very tied up with motherhood. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And so you have very vigorous fights about motherhood. Often women my age look at younger women who want to take a longer leave or go part-time and say, well, my kids are fine. I worked full-time the whole time. And her identity is on the line. And then often you have fights between child-free women, women who didn't want children, or childless women, women who are regretful that the structure, the clockwork of male careers precluded their ability to have children. And these fights become very, very bitter, again, because they're a classic difficult conversation, an identity conversation. So it's very important to recognize that if you have tug of war in your environment, it's not proof that this isn't about women. It's proof that this is a symptom of gender bias in the environment. The most important message is that there is no wrong way to be a woman. And to recognize the limits of sisterhood. After all, do men always support other men? That doesn't mean they're bitches, that they don't. Two strategies for making an enemy into an ally. If somebody is undercutting you, this is from Powerful GC, actually, in the Bay Area. She went straight to the person and said, if I've done anything to offend you, I really would like to hear about it, because I have the highest respect for you and I want us to be friends, and I would never undercut you in public and don't expect you to do that. So let's just talk it through. She never heard another peep. Also, from my mentee, Linda Chano, who now runs the Texas Center, I was talking with her about this, and she said one of the most effective things that younger women can do is just to say thank you. Thank you for paving the way. but I'm going to do it my way. And for me, I think, since I'm one of those older women, I'm not going to compete as a boy because I'm not a boy. For me, that's victory. Senior women, remember that younger women's experience is different from yours. That's what we worked for. And young women, very important, remember that you may feel that the senior women have a lot more power than they do. They are still proving it again. That never ends. So get the women working together, but not on women's issues, because then you'll lose the Marissa Myers. Here's the book. Since my daughter wrote it, I can plug it. And please send us your comments and feedback at New Girls Network. Thank you. Okay, I wanted to talk, first of all, we had a very interesting conversation on the phone, and I was a little shocked. You've all been, these are really high-power litigators here, every single one. And Mary, as you heard, now sits on boards. And many of them had stories about being in situations where there were fewer women than they expected. And Donna, you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, hi Hastings, and thank you. Congratulations, Women's Law Journal, on 25 years. Thanks for inviting us here today. And Speaker Pelosi's, or former Speaker Pelosi's speech was so incredible. Anyway, I took the bench just about 4 years ago, and it's really struck me how few times I see women in the courtroom. Now, being in the courtroom is the cherry job. It's the visible job. It's where you get to carry your client's banner and talk to the judge and make your arguments, counter to your opponent's arguments, and it has client cachet, and maybe you get to bring home the laurels. It's very important to an outcome of a case. I would argue it's not necessarily the most important, but it's seen as very important. So I would expect to see women in the courtroom in relatively equal proportion to where they might be in the profession at a partner or a senior associate level. So let's say 35%. And I often walk in to a room where I am the only woman in the courtroom. And, I get to pack a gavel, so people, I have a voice, but it really is a little bit disappointing to see how few times women get to come up to the podium.
Teresa, you had a funny story about the Ninth Circuit.
Oh, okay. And interest. I usually talk to groups of ERISA lawyers, so it's extremely exciting to be here. I want to say you're a much larger and more interesting and more diverse audience than I normally get to speak to, so I really appreciate this event. Like Judge Ryu, I'm often the only woman in the room, whether it's the courtroom or the conference room, on litigation teams or, with opponents. I had an experience where I was speaking in the Ninth Circuit, appearing in the Ninth Circuit, arguing. And for those of you who haven't been to court yet, when you arrive in court, you go and check in with the clerk. And there were 7 matters on the calendar that day. And I walked up to the clerk to check in, and she said, "Oh, you must be Teresa Renaker." And I said, "Well, how on earth would you know that?" And she said, "Well, it's because you're the only woman arguing today." And in fact, that was true. There were 15, 17 lawyers probably arguing that day, multiple lawyers on some cases, and I was, in fact, the only woman who stood up.
So I have a little story. So I'm Pat Gillette. Thank you. Happy to be here, and thank you, Joan, for the presentation, which I thought was really interesting and quite challenging for all of you out there. I'm what you call a rainmaker, so I have a very, very large book of business and have had a large book of business for many, many years. So I have the opposite kind of story. I'm often the only woman in the room who is making a pitch to clients. So I'll be the woman in the room making the pitch with my team, who often consists of men and women, going up against other teams of lawyers who are made up of all men. And so I find that sort of an interesting place to be, because I happen to think that women are very, very good at building relationships and at getting people to hire them. The problem is that we don't often recognize it. So I use being the only woman in the room when I'm a rainmaker to present my case for why someone should hire me in a very different way from the way men present that case. and usually I get hired. So it's been fun in that instance to be the only woman in the room because the men just don't think the same way. They get up, do the same thing with every single client. Oh, we're a global law firm. We partner with our clients. We love doing work, blah, blah, blah. I get up and say, here's my team. My team works together. I brought my associates with me because I want you to meet them. Here's so-and-so who has a really interesting idea about how they might handle your case, and I let one of the men or women on my team talk. It's a very different approach. But it's a different way of being the only woman in the room. There are ways to distinguish yourself, and people remember and hopefully work to inure to your benefit.
Marion Kelly, do you want to?
You know, this is a very interesting issue. I think I'm sitting here listening to the fact that there still aren't too many women in the courtroom, and frankly, it's depressing to me. I haven't been in the courtroom for about close to 15 years now. There weren't very many when I left litigation. I think that it's really the consequence of the male gender bias being unaddressed in the litigation side of the house. You know, if you think about who is the stereotypic litigator, it is a white male. And unless a law firm is good about addressing gender bias, it's just going to be tougher for women to prove that they're top litigators. Certain women have an innate, you know, take charge personality that allows them to kind of break through it, but many women just say, you know, this is too tough, and they vote with their feet quite legitimately. And so I think until that's changed, it's going to continue to be a bit of a problem. But I want to talk about the dynamics of being the only woman in the room, because that is an experience that you will all have, unfortunately, probably way too many times. And in the boardroom, it's very interesting. I've been on boards where I'm the only woman, one of two, one of three. There's no question that to be heard in the typical boardroom, which is made up mostly of male CEOs, so they're not only male, but they're extremely leader-oriented, and some of them are what I call alpha dog males, who don't hear women very well. And so if you're the only woman in the room, it's taken every trick I've learned in my 45-year career to be heard in that room. I can do it, but it takes a lot of work. You add another woman, it gets easier. When the third woman comes in, all of a sudden, all that stuff goes away. And I'm talking about, your idea being stolen by the guy sitting next to you, all that kind of stuff. When there's three women in the room, it just melts away. And so that's why you see so much pressure to get at least three women on a board, because then women can operate without having to double think everything. So what I would recommend to all of you is that you read the book. Educate yourself completely about how gender bias works, because there's now a ton of research out there that has all the techniques for neutralizing it for you. And I think the women who've broken through to the top of my generation kind of figured it out by trial and error. But now you don't have to even figure it out. It's all there for you. And if you really, really educate yourself now at the front end of your career, you'll find that you'll be able to just, accomplish things with much less resistance, and you'll have a much more fun career.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Dermody. It's good to see you all. You're going to hear a lot of gloom and doom, I think, in part today, and I want to say something to qualify that, which is, just by example, on this panel, these four women and I have been working really in independent silos in our careers. And these are all women that I have admired early in my career from afar, and as time moved on, got to know better. At least three of the four of them, either they or I got the other one appointed to some commission or some committee or some other thing. And if you had picked, and I don't think Joan knew that at all when she picked this panel, if you picked another slice of five women doing what we're all doing in our silos, you would have gotten the same exact interconnected network of people admiring each other and helping each other. So if you're practicing, particularly in the Bay Area, congratulations, welcome to the party. There's a great network and sisterhood out there looking out for you. And as you come up, make sure to look out for each other, because that network will do you much good over time. It is unfortunately true that there is a persistent problem of gender bias, not just in law, but on Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And I have been my whole career representing women challenging glass ceilings and glass walls in all sorts of environments. And in the last 10 years, mostly a lot of professional women. And it is really, really frustrating. And I think there are lots of strategies, but you'll hear a lot today about being authentic and about not putting up with crap and just being a good professional. And keep that in mind, because there's lots of ways people will expect you to be, but if you can just drive through that, and just be a good professional, you're going to be on the right track most of the time. In this area of being the only one in the room, so I'll just say this, Morris Ratner, who's here, when I joined Lieff Cabraser 19 years ago, Morris was already there and was a good mentor to me at the firm. And I was one of pretty few women at the time, but my firm was led in part by a woman, and that broke open a lot of doors. But being in a plaintiff's profession, where a lot of the firms are basically firms that were founded by a guy with his brother or his cousin or his best friend or someone that was referred to his dad through some network, it's a lot of men in my field. And in our field, because of how we organize ourselves, we end up often being in a big collection of firms where there aren't many women in the room. And you see this borne out, even now in the 2000s, when you go to these, what they call multi-district litigation panels, where every other month, somewhere in the country, the federal courts bring together all of the similar cases to figure out if they should be coordinated and sent to one district. It's a very smart efficiency. But once in a while, I'll have a case that gets caught up in the MDL, and I'll go to the panel hearing to argue for my cases to be consolidated. And one of those hearings a couple years ago was in, I think, Boise, Idaho. Just they get sent different places around the country. And it was the same hearing time as the BP oil litigation. So there were all these guys from the South who were there arguing for Houston or New Orleans or, wherever their case was, that should be where the cases would be sent. Hundreds of lawyers descended on that little town. And in the courtroom, and all the lawyers that were there to argue to the panel about different cases, there were 4 women. One was my partner, Elizabeth Cabraser, arguing in the BP case, and one was me on some little wage hour case. And there basically were 2 women heard from in the, 40 different lawyers standing up to say something that day. It was pretty depressing that is really still where we are. I think that was 2011. I have a case in Silicon Valley right now. It's a case that involves a lot of defendants in one case, and they all have different counsel. And our judge is Judge Lucy Coe. And during oral argument at some point, one of the defense lawyers, a man who stood up and was arguing about some point, had conferred with the table of defense lawyers and made reference to, on behalf of my brethren, and there was one woman from one of the defense firms at that table, and he corrected himself and said, oh, and sisterin. And Judge Coe interrupted him and said, it'd be nice to see more sisterin at the table. Because it was really noticeable when he pointed that out. And sure enough, since that time, every hearing since, every one of those firms has brought a woman to the courtroom, but still no women speak on that side.
Yeah, the token.
Frustrating. So there's much work to be done, but you're going to do it.
Kelly, when you're in that situation with all of those guys, how do you break through as a woman? I have a feeling it's a different style than we've heard.
Well, it changes over the course of your career because you have a body of success or business that you have a track record. But I think when you're, like many of the strategies you've heard, other contexts, when you're a young lawyer and you're the only one of your group, whatever that demographic is, in the room, I think you have to find a way to have your voice heard. So you're not someone that can be easily ignored. And it's not just talking to talk. And I'm sure all of you have been in law classes where someone just cannot stop talking and they add nothing to the dialogue. So I'm not encouraging that. But if you are the person that knows the law on something or knows the facts on something, and very frequently when you're dealing with older lawyers that have a sense of entitlement and privilege about their status, they don't prepare as much because they're going to talk and have an opinion, and of course people will listen. But you might actually know what's going on, and that when you talk and it's concrete and specific, people will start to listen to you and expect that you're going to add to the conversation, and they might invite you into further opportunities to speak up, to represent a position, to research something, make yourself valuable or invaluable in cases.
Can I just add something that I think that's a critical point? I'd just like to talk a little bit about the research on this, though, because there's no doubt that in mixed power groups, women speak up much less. So you've really got to overcome that inner, reluctance to speak up. And women also tend to not think they should speak up until they're very certain of the substantive information. So that's why I wanted to say something about that. If you think you have something to contribute, even if it's not fully formed, you will do yourself a huge favor by just speaking up more than your comfort zone allows. That one change in behavior is going to make you much more effective in the group. And I think the more you try it, the more comfortable you become and the more it becomes second nature. But gender bias is unconscious, it's not malicious, and it's always trumped by facts. So if you're not speaking up, you're not putting yourself out there showing what you can do. So it's probably the most critical thing we could tell you today.
Two thoughts as a new associate in my experience, a law firm, that you can do to really position yourself for these kinds of opportunities is if you're working with a partner who's preparing for an argument, for example, to use Kelly's example, what you want to do is make sure that you sit in, play moot court with that partner, show the partner that you know the law, et cetera, and then, and this has happened to me several times because I'm old, I'll be up arguing a case and I'll think, oh my God, I'm not sure what the case is. I'll turn to my associate and say, could you address the court on that? So you want to not only be prepared, be preparing your partner, but you want to be prepared to speak up if you have to, mentally, and have the material ready so that you can do that. It's a great opportunity, and many partners will give you that opportunity if they feel confident that you're able to do it. And then I want to echo one thing that Mary said, and that is the importance of not being afraid or thinking that your opinion isn't as significant or as substantive as other people's. We as women very often feel we have to be perfect, we have to have the perfect answer, the absolute right answer, God forbid that we're wrong. And we'll talk in a little while about presentation style, but don't wait to have the perfect response. Men don't wait for that. They often speak when they shouldn't. I'm not encouraging you to do that, but I bet you've got things to say and you shouldn't be afraid to say them.
Can I pile on here for a second?
Sorry, go on.
Okay.
Jump in.
All right. So, yeah, I was thinking about how experience breeds competence, which breeds more experience. So when you have an experience and you can talk about it competently to somebody, then they see you as somebody who can take on the next experience. So I have some very practical advice for this particular audience, having come from the clinical faculty here at Hastings. So I have 2 law clerks right now. One of them was my former student here at Hastings. As a second-year law student, she first chaired a 6-day trial in San Francisco Superior Court. Why? Because she was in the clinic and she had that opportunity. You can, to be able to talk with an employer about what it meant to craft a cross-examination, and how there was this tricky point where she had to, assess the risk of doing it, etc. It's amazing, and it vaulted her into a really great job. I lured her away later, but my other law clerk from NYU also had experience in court as a law student because she took a clinic. So that's one place to get experience before you even walk out this door. Other places, pro bono work. So my life partner works for a nonprofit and public interest organization, and last summer there was this explosion of like 100 administrative trials that came up out of the blue. So they got on a whole bunch of pro bono counsel from big firms, and those firms assigned junior associates to do a whole bunch of administrative trials where they had to put on evidence. And it was great training ground. The firms loved it, and now those young associates can talk about, oh yeah, well I did that administrative trial. So looking for those opportunities to jump on and boost yourself up is really great. And there's a way in which visibility also, so to the extent you need to prove yourself more, to get out of that do loop, one strategy is to be more visible, because visibility kind of reads as a proxy for competence. Oh, well, so-and-so is head, on the leadership council of the Barristers Club, which is a young lawyers group here in San Francisco. That must mean that she's a great leader. That must mean, so getting those positions and not just in your firms, but in the community can be very, very powerful.
Teresa, I saw you earlier.
Well, I do think that you know, the ways to make yourself visible and to take opportunities vary a lot. And Pat and I had a conversation about this on the phone. With the structure that you're in, what is the nature of the work that's being done? Is it the kind of work where you have repeat clients? I typically don't have repeat clients. My clients only want to litigate once in their lives, if that. Is it so where there's a kind of, you're developing those long-term client relationships, or is it, more like in my business or Kelly's, I think, where you're developing networks with other lawyers and bringing in work that way. What is the compensation structure? Does the compensation structure, kind of favor, are people getting credit for bringing in cases? Are they getting credit for working on cases? Are they getting credit for the number of hours that they work? In my firm, we don't do any of those things. So we have less of I think, an incentive for people to be proprietary about cases and clients and so forth. But I'm in a 19-attorney firm. It's a very small firm, and what I encourage young women in my firm to do is to take as much ownership as you can grab. If you write the motion, you should write it like you're assuming you're going to argue it, and you should go forward with that assumption until somebody tells you differently. And if they tell you differently, you should know the reason why. What is the justification for having the person who put in all the work and got that piece of writing together, subsequently to be edited by many other people always, but who did the groundwork, not taking the leadership role on putting those arguments in front of the court orally. And I think it's very important to think about, how does that work in your structure? In some firms, the way it works is that you start out maybe getting a leadership role in the pro bono cases or something of that nature. In my firm, it's hard to tell the difference between what's pro bono and what's profit-generating work. So, a whole lot of what we do would be considered pro bono. I think it's important to know your structure, know how people get opportunities in that structure, and then take those opportunities. Put yourself out there, to get those opportunities to gain that experience, as Judge Ryu said.
So as you've heard people say, it's very important, particularly for women, but this is also true of shy guys, to be comfortable outside your comfort zone. And you have to know yourself first. If you are the person whose hand was always up in class, you probably don't need to talk even more than you think you should, right? But if you are the person who never had a hard time raising your hand, you should think about your comfort zone and think about stretching out of it, because I think it was Teresa said, or someone, was it Pat? One of you ladies in the middle said that sometimes visibility is taken as evidence of leadership. And yet, I want to take this one step further, because often advice stops there. Just go outside your comfort zone, go for it, girl, and the sky's the limit. But what the studies show is that, unfortunately, more information does not always eliminate bias. More information eliminates descriptive bias, the prove it again bias. So you can show people that you are competent by providing more evidence of competence. That's true. But to the extent that the bias is prescriptive, this is the way a woman should behave. If your audience is someone who has kind of traditional ideas about how women should behave, then by providing more evidence of your competence may make actually things even worse, because then you're a lippy, arrogant woman. And so I guess, and Teresa said this in a very apt way in our prep call. The studies, she didn't say the studies, I added the studies. The studies suggest that there's still a very narrow range of behavior that people experience as acceptable in powerful women. Now, again, this is not always true, and it varies from employer to employer, firm to firm. Some places you already have all of the advice that you need. Go for it, girl, or go for it, guy. You're young, you got to show your stuff. But what I wanted people to talk about is, what if you've done that and you get a feeling that something is not quite clicking here, and that you're considered a bit much in several directions. What do you do then in terms of a mid-course correction? Mary, I know you've talked about this a lot.
Well, let me start by saying that absolutely the first point is authenticity. So when you're getting all these tips and techniques, it's got to be around an authentic core. But your authenticity is not compromised by behavior modification when it serves your ends, you know, so take it all in that grain. The thing that we all have to recognize is that the stereotypes are actually in our heads as well as men's heads. It's a cultural stereotype, so we carry them. Now, in our heads, they come up as self-doubt, criticism of our behavior. In men's heads, they come up as a prescription about who you are or what your behavior is. So there's a couple things. I think one is to get very clear inside about what you really want. Because then, if you start to go for what you want, and it's a little bit beyond what your own psyche thinks you can do, the gift is that you will have in your head all kinds of self-doubts. What are those self-doubts? It's just showing you where you're carrying gender bias. So you kind of ignore it, and you go for it anyway. So that will make you implicitly, every day, much more powerful. You're showing up for what you really authentically want, and you're not letting your own head stop you. So that's the first step. And then, you know, if you're clear about your goals, you can make choices every day that help you move in that direction. If you're not clear, if you're basically, you know, kind of hoping that you can make it in this environment and trying to figure out what everybody else's goals for you are, you'll always be muddled. You got to start with your authentic, where you want to go, and then you deal with your own gender bias. And then there are a lot of techniques for speaking up in ways that don't trigger off the bitch dynamic. And one of them is using humor. Most senior women are very funny because they've learned all these ways to just talk about things with
we think we are.
Well, yeah, we laugh at our own jokes. Yeah. Another is to, when you feel angry on the inside, it's probably better for you to walk out of the room, take a deep breath, and figure out why you're angry. You know, what is it about this situation that's making you feel powerless? And then that'll be in your own head. That'll be your own bias in your own head. And then go back in there when you are very clear about what you want and can talk about it in a calmer tone of voice. Because anger is something, I don't know why, but it does seem to scare men. Probably scares women too, but it does scare men. So it's not a very effective modality for women to use. Another thing is just good empathy. So if a guy is making a point and you're in a dialogue and you want something for yourself, I usually acknowledge the point. Yeah, so really, that is a good point. And then I'll say something like, there's a couple other perspectives I think we need to take into account here as well. And then I'll put out some other ideas that usually make the, you know, often are, you know, they're clearly more powerful, they're really more appropriate. And that will change the direction of the discussion without getting into a power struggle. So that's just one example, but there are many, many techniques for moving the conversation along without engaging it in a resistant way. And for women, that's just much more effective. And then if you're in a situation where people are stealing your ideas, I just make a joke of it. You know, I have to tell you guys, I'm seeing the behavior that most annoys all the senior women in this country. You've just stolen my idea. You know, and I do it in that kind of a joking way. And, you know, the behavior changes. It really does. So these are all techniques, but I think the most important thing is to realize that the person you have the most control over is yourself. And you actually can't change people's unconscious bias directly. But if you know where you think you're stuck and you learn to advocate for yourself and speak up, your information will be going out there trumping everybody else's gender thoughts about you. So that's my best advice.
Before people jump in, I'm eager to have other people jump in. Notice that both Pat and Mary did the classic mixing the masculine with the feminine technique. Pat, the rainmaker, coming in saying mine is best, and yet she did it by standing up for her team. And being, so a very feminine, doing a masculine thing in a feminine communal tone. Mary also did the same thing. She's going like, you're full of it, but she doesn't say that. She goes, well, you know, there's some other, your perspective is very, very, very powerful. Let's think about from these other perspectives. Again, I mean, I guess, I don't know who this is for, and people can jump in, but at what point is it not worth it? That's an important question, and that's an important thing for each person to think about early in your career. But those are techniques that work.
So I think one of the things that we don't talk enough about to young lawyers is emotional IQ. Because a lot of being a lawyer is persuading other people or impressing other people or making your presence known. And that has to do with having a very high level of emotional IQ, knowing how to read your audience, which means you're going to react one way to the room of men that's very macho, and you're going to react a different way to the room of men that's more showing more empathy and more engagement with you. So part of it is emotional IQ, but I want to echo something that Mary said, because I just think it's so important for you as you enter your legal career, and that is women tend to take things personally, and that results in emotional responses that are and are not correct. It's correct to have the emotional response. It's not correct to show it in front of everyone else. And I say this because my mother told me the faults we see in others are the faults we see in ourselves. And I am one of those people who reacts emotionally first, takes everything personally, and then steps back and says, wait a minute. So when I speak on these issues, I always encourage people, especially women, to not take things personally. I have a house of men, 2 sons and a husband. And what I see in them is that stuff just rolls off of them. You know, you have a fight, they're done with it. Me, I'm like, oh, I could have said this, I could have said that. Did they really mean that? Oh my God, right? I'm processing it, and I think most women do that. We process, and we're thinking it's all about they don't like me, or they do like me, or they... Don't take it personally. The other thing is that when you're in your legal career, you're always managing up, right? You're managing up to the people who you report to, you're managing up to your clients, you're managing up to leadership in the firm, and part of your job is to make them look good. In the process, you will look good. And I just liken it to interviews. I think this is one of my favorite things. I do a lot of mock interviews at law schools, and I always tell people the best interview is when someone lets the interviewer talk about themselves, right? Then you go, wow, that person was really impressive because she asked me all about me, right? It's really good to be able to compliment other people, to listen to other people, to show empathy, to ask about other people. Those kinds of things make you more likable and give you a lot of information and insight into what makes that person work and what makes that person tick, thus raising your emotional IQ so you know how to deal with that person going forward. So those are the kinds of things that I think you ought to think about as you enter your legal career in terms of what challenges you're going to have in addressing the sometimes hostile work environments that you're going to face.
Although we did have a lot of back and forth on the call, so I think we have a very interesting point. Let's hear others.
I have a thought. So a lot of really good themes are swirling up here, and there's like no way to lasso all of them, but I'm going to just throw out another thing. So when I think about the best preparation that I had to be a litigator, it was I played organized sports, and I was a lacrosse player in college, and I played lacrosse goalie. And you can't get a shutout playing lacrosse goalie, FYI. So I had one, I think. You never have a perfect game. And you always have to show up and be, able to be resilient from the defeats that you have. And being a litigator is a lot like lacrosse goalie. There is never an unblemished record. There's never perfection. You think you have the perfect discovery dispute and you get creamed. Things happen. Things go wrong, facts come in poorly, clients don't present well after they've impressed you for years, they fall apart. I mean, it just happens, right? So you have to bounce back. And there was a study that was done, and I wish I had the presence of mind to pull it off, it was the Wall Street Journal years ago, looking at the top women on Wall Street. And something like 80% of the top women on Wall Street had played organized sports in high school or college. And I think the lesson from that, besides how great Title IX is that learning how to be an individual success story within a team, learning how to have victories and defeats and be gracious in both, are skills that are absolutely fundamental as you are in the professional area. And I think that because, in part, men sort of are organized so much more around those themes and so much earlier, that those traits are really instilled in them very early. I don't want to be so essentialist in all these conversations about what men are like, but I do think there's a real benefit from knowing how to self-promote within the team, knowing how to raise your ideas on behalf of the team, but also knowing how to be an individual and be individually successful in the midst of a lot of other people in the competitive environment. So if you can think about this, in addition to the gender lens, something much more meta is happening around people are interacting around their thoughts and their goals in the workplace.
And I guess I'll throw something else in here because I'm one of the ones who struggled in our phone call when we got on this topic about the so-called tug of war and the narrow band of what's acceptable behavior on an axis of masculine, feminine. And later on, I was reflecting on why did I have such a bad reaction, and it made me think about this thing that I went through as a kid. I was a Girl Scout. I was a really good Girl Scout. I was a brownie, I was a junior, I was a cadet. I learned how to camp. My family did not camp. I learned, Indian lore, California plants. I loved it. And I got to cadet, which is when you're going into, I think, 6th, 7th grade. And so it's a weird time anyway. But I remember there was this one day, and I don't know, I have in my mind it was a rainy day, so we weren't outside, and our troop leader, I don't think she came up with this. I think it was something that was maybe and if you've run out of ideas, here's something you can do. And she said, today we're going to learn how to walk in a feminine way. And, it was the weirdest thing because I knew that I could not walk in a feminine way. I still am way more of a
Donna,
stomper.
I got the same lesson from my mother.
Is that right? Okay, so, but it was humiliating because we were supposed to critique each other, and I still don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know.
My steps were too long.
Oh no, they're going to watch you walk out now.
Yeah, exactly. But here's my point. My point is that I quit the Girl Scouts within a month, and I think it was because really, when I boil it down, there was this. I was so good at being a Girl Scout. I learned so much from it. And then there was apparently this core competency of walking like a woman that was, I was never going to get. And so it deterred me, right? So I don't want the message to be, hey, I worked with students of every stripe when I was here, okay? Shy women, over-the-top aggressive women, guys who were aggressive, guys who would get all sweaty and flustered when they tried to argue, trans students, students who perform their gender in a very androgynous way. I'm a lesbian. We all present in different ways. The last thing I want to do is tell this crowd, so you need to work within this band of behavior. You be yourself, but work within this band, and that's, an unfortunate truth. It's not. It's not. I know so many people who are happy, successful lawyers who, especially here in the Bay Area, we get to fly your little freak flag a little bit more than you would in other parts of the country. So, I echo what's on Joan's slide, what's being said here about first and foremost, you have to ground yourself in who you are and then work from there. I am the person who wouldn't raise my hand in class. I'm still the person who in the judges meeting, once in a while. It's hard, but I accept that and I work on it. Anyway, that's my point.
I think one of the things you're learning is about how to choose the kind of organization you want to work in. You don't need to work inside the band if you don't want to be in the band. And we have very different career tracks here. I think Teresa, you've been
real quick on that. Yeah, I think that as I've gone through my career, I've been mentored by a lot of absolutely terrific women who were senior to me, and one common experience that I've had has been that many of them, at some point or another, I was told by somebody, she's just out of control. She's mad with power. She's a complete harridan. Her clerks are afraid to go to the bathroom when she's in chambers. She once threw a shoe at a secretary, this kind of thing. And really, first of all, I've never found I always found these women to be very warm and very easy to deal with, first of all, so I have no idea whether any of those stories were actually true. But I think that kind of thing, one thing that really struck me, I recall, I think I said on the phone, that was that I was told one of these anecdotes about a woman I worked with in law school, and some 20 years later, a woman who was working in my firm, who was a law student, told me volunteered to me the same story about that woman. And so that story has been going around about that powerful woman in our legal community for at least 20 years, maybe longer. And I have no idea if it's even true, but it's repeated and repeated. And I think it's done to discipline us. I mean, I'm not saying, there's a conscious conspiracy, let's tell a lot of mean stories about powerful women so, younger women won't, affiliate with them, or younger women will be afraid to be perceived that way. But I do think that there's an element of that is going on unconsciously, and I would encourage you, first of all, if you hear that kind of thing about me, don't believe it. Or anybody else, who might be a mentor to you, whether you're a young woman lawyer or a young man lawyer. And don't be afraid, I think, that people will say that kind of thing about you, because I think that at least for our generation, and perhaps, for more generations to come, if you are a powerful woman, somebody probably is going to say something about that, like that about you, and it just comes with the territory, and don't be disciplined by it.
Yeah, I would say better a bitch than a doormat.
Amen.
On the other hand, what you see here is a sort of classic struggle between the femmes and the tomboys, and partly it's whether you feel that the ability to do things in a feminine tone is authentic for you and is valuable, or whether you feel it violates very deeply who you are. And so that's why women choose very, very different strategies, and frankly, the men choose very different strategies too. Because when you think about it, masculine, feminine, these are just different ways of being in the world, and most people have both of them. Most actual intact human beings have them both.
Can I make one point, Joan, just to encourage people? What's very interesting is that you see a lot of general counsels who are now women. And the men are having to present to the women. So they're having to adjust their behavior in the same way that we've had to adjust our behavior for years. So there is hope out there that maybe we will see some changes in that.
I would say that part of the reason we're teaching you or talking about these little tips and rules of the road that might make it easier is to give you some tools. And they're not, as I said earlier, they're not personality adjustments. They're just, you're having a little struggle and you try one of these and see if it helps you. And so it becomes an authentic tool for you. And I have found that all these recognitions of what works helped me to do was just be more effective in the environment. And slowly but surely, I needed them less and less as my own inner confidence built. And so now I don't even think about this kind of stuff. It's just sort of innate. It's become part of, just how I am in the world. So, it feels maybe a little more prescriptive when you're young because you're just trying to figure it out and trying to make it work. And eventually the ones that really work for you will become you. And then you won't have to worry about it.
Are we out of time? Okay. Yeah, let's have some Q&A. We actually went through, as you saw, 2 of the 4 patterns, but that's okay. I think we had a very rich discussion, and I think it got some of the nuance out, which is important.
Hear you.
Break those gender biases. And I'd love to hear comments from the panel on whether they see anything similar about men trying to also take care of families.
Cheryl Stein's been talking about this a lot in Steinberg in her remarks, and I think men who are brave enough to take on this role do experience some backlash out there, and I think we just have to call it out and keep talking about it. This is a huge cultural shift, but it's critical for real equality for men and women in the workplace. So hallelujah for bringing it up.
If men start doing it, the good news is then it becomes quote-unquote normal, and then it's okay for women to take time off and for men to take off. So
but the first men out there,
we want to encourage them. No, I'm saying we just want to be supportive.
Yeah, exactly.
There are men who get rewarded, though, because like, oh, isn't that great? He went to the soccer game. Oh, he took time off. You know, there is that thing that goes, whereas the women are doing that every day and getting scolded for it. So there is that other tension that exists. But I think we got to encourage men to take all these benefits. And I think Gen Y, I love Gen Y, because I think we're going to see much more of that pattern. Your generation is going to change because men are going to demand the things that used to be quote-unquote women's issues.
The other thing is that the center has just published research on what we call the flexibility stigma. And this doesn't have to do with guys who are at home full time, but men who are working and actually ask for parental leave or a flexible schedule. And what the research now shows is that there is a very strong stigma associated with that, stronger actually for men than for women, and that the reason for it is because they are seen as too feminine. So I think to the extent that there are organizations where men magically don't take parental leave, I just would like to hear from Pat. I think that there's really a risk management dimension to that at this point, given this new social science.
I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, if there's an environment in an organization that sends a very strong message to men that they shouldn't take parental leave because they're too feminine, that seems to me risking not only that seems to me risking liability under two different federal statutes.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's the good news. See, that's why it's good to be on the defense side, because you say to your client, you better not be doing that, because if you are, that would be a huge problem.
And this is why the center works with defense lawyers, as well as plaintiffs' lawyers.
You need both. So I'm going to come around with a microphone, so just raise your hand and I can come by. Some good exercise.
Hi there. Thank you all for speaking today. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to expand a little more on this idea of balancing between feminine and masculine. And it kind of reminded me of this concept of the special snowflake, or the female chauvinist pig who is clearly trying to play the political game, but takes it a little too far and will kind of disassociate herself from other women, like, oh, I'm not like other women, I'm not that emotional, like, I'm not like that, I'm just one of the guys. And they're trying to play the game, but they're contributing to a lot of harmful ideas about women, and they're contributing to making the workplace a negative place for women to be. And so I wondered if any of you had experience with that, with your colleagues or clients, and how you deal with that.
Yeah, this is the tug of war.
So I would love to speak to that, because I have a story that just infuriates me every time I think about it. One of my partners, who's a very powerful woman, got up in front of our entire partnership and said, she got an award, and she said, I got here without ever needing any affirmative action at all. I just could not even believe she did that. So there are those women out there. I call them the queen bees. They exist. They're, I think, more in our generation than in the generations coming up.
And the great Madeleine Albright quote, there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women.
Exactly. And my feeling about them is you're not going to change their behavior if they're in my age range any more than you're going to change any white male who feels that way. I'd leave them alone and not look to them for support. There are plenty of other women out there who are willing to support you. It's a sad statement, but I do believe there are other women out there. It's a tragedy.
The other thing I would say is, though, you're never the powerless victim, so you have some negativity around you. I would get clear about what you would really like more of in the environment, and then become kind of the organizing principle. Go find some like-minded women, find some great men, try to get something positive going, as opposed to, one of the great lessons in my life was when I realized that you can put in a lot of energy resisting the problem, or you can just leave it there and go for what you want. And that's what I would really say. And fortunately now, there's enough good out there, as you're saying, that you can find it. And as you were saying, when do you vote with your feet? Well, in your gut, you'll know. You've been trying. The good news is nowadays there are many organizations that are phenomenally good for women. So you don't have to sit in a, piece of shit organization.
To use a technical term, Kelly, I think you were...
Yeah, I think there really are sort of three responses to those things, right? You accept it, You confront it, or you do a workaround. And I'm kind of not an ever accept it person. I just constitutionally can't tolerate things, but I'm a big workaround. And I really think the idea of working with men and women, that gender equity and fairness in the workplace isn't just a women's issue, it's everyone's issue. And there are tons of great men in our organizations, in our profession. I mean, I'm not suggesting that they're all perfect, but there are tons that are really, really great mentors to women and men. And look for them. You know, don't consider women to be the only people that will pave the way for you. It will frequently be men.
Hear, hear. We got to bring men into this conversation because Mary and I know from the many speeches we do, you usually talk to a room full of women who all nod their heads, and that's very confirming and wonderful, but most of the time they don't have any power within their organizations.
And let me say,
men are allies, not enemies.
Send some of the men in the room, and also to all of you, the prove it again bias, which I think is the one that is probably the most pervasive, and I think your research showed it, you know, that women are just, their potential is under-recognized. So women know it because we're the ones who have the internal, you know, reaction to the problem, and we're trying to struggle against it and trying to prove ourselves. Men, good-hearted men, some of the best men I know, are very aware of women's issues, but they cannot see this. It's literally invisible to them. And so you have to educate people about it and pick the great ones and really help them get up the curve on what this gender bias looks like, plays out, and acknowledge the fact that you don't expect them to be able to see it in the room because it's unconscious to men, all men.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the work of one of the focuses of the center now is on building alliances with men for the reason that you've all heard. And one of the potentials now is that there's this tug of war among women of this is the right way to be a woman, no, this is the right way to be a woman. It's really begun to happen also among men, where you have this younger generation of men. Some of them, their wives are the big career, and they have a career or no, which is supportive, or they are at home full-time. But also there are a lot of couples where they switch off the big career. And that generation of men often they kind of don't want what the older guys want. And it may be just sort of the alpha dog presentation that they find off-putting as well. And then there's the work-family stuff. But what the research is beginning to show, and there's actually an extremely important study out of Boston showing that there was a rule that residents could not work more than 80 hours a week. They were working 120 hours a week. And what the women did in order to bring the full-time down from 120 to 80 hours is they aligned with 3 groups of men, these younger men who just didn't want that job description. And the alliance of the younger men and the women completely transformed the workplace. And I think that's one of the hopes and part of the potential. Because when you think about all of these sort of crimps that we've heard that women experience from gender and these sort of straitjacket expectations, a lot of men feel similar things from what the expectations are of them. And that's the opportunity.
Question here in the back, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for providing not only sort of theoretical information, but very practical information. I had a question. I come from 10 plus years in the advertising industry that works very differently from the legal industry, and I was president and CEO of a pretty large entity. And I just have to say that I'm really kind of shocked and dismayed at the way the whole legal industry works with the big law model. And I'm wondering where people go in, they have to basically get burned and churned, they work their way up from one company to another. It takes 3, 5, 7, maybe 10 years before they even have the opportunity to get out and speak, as you're suggesting that women do. And what chances are there for even changing the way the whole industry works, the methodology, which doesn't fit in with women and women's life cycles, and probably is very difficult for men as well?
So I'll start, because in 2006 I started something called the Opt-in Project, which said let's stop talking about work-life balance, let's start talking about changing the structure of law firms, because I think that's where the problem lies. In 2007, I went around the country and spoke to large groups of managing partners, and I was shouted down off the stage, basically. In 2008, when the recession hit, you began to see law firms thinking about changing their structures, and I'm talking big law here. Mid-sized firms had started that a long time ago, not a long time ago, but years before, where we began to look at the career paths of people differently, and to think about the fact that you're out of law school doesn't mean anything, that maybe we should measure by competency, that maybe merit should be important, that maybe qualitative work versus quantitative things should be. You can measure billable hours, but you can also measure how good the work is that's coming out, and maybe that ought to trump some of the things. So you began to see a change in the recession as law firms realized that people were a valuable asset, that they had to, in fact, think about them differently and treat them differently, at least in big law. The problem is that as the economy's coming back, we're seeing law firms go back to the more traditional models, feeling some comfort in the way things used to be, because what do we as lawyers do? We advise our clients to take risks, but what are lawyers? Risk adverse for themselves. Oh, don't change the model, it's always been this way. So it's a struggle, at least for big law. Teresa, you might have a different experience.
Well, let me say something. I think this is a very good perspective, and one of the things about my career is I've switched out of law. I'm now sitting on corporate boards, and there's no question that corporations are way ahead of law firms in terms of their the sophistication of their approach to enhancing women's careers, and law is kind of a following function. And I share your concern and your concern. I think if law firms don't get this, it's going to be pretty woman-free. And I think the litigation statistics that we were seeing at the beginning is just an example of it. And I think it will be competitive pressures that make it change. As you were saying, lawyers are risk adverse. I also think lawyers underestimate the risk of the status quo again and again and again. And so it's going to be a tough couple of years. But I think women coming out of law school today who choose to go into large law firms, armed with a lot of this information, can make a huge difference. And I think you're going to have an experience that is significantly different than women over the past generations. So I think it's a problem.
And a final info bit, if you look at it demographically, only 14% of American mothers work over 50 hours a week during the key years of career advancement.
And they're mostly in law firms,
Until we address that, that's a threshold issue, which is one of the central concerns, of course, at the Center for Work-Life Law. Please help me thank these wonderful panel.
Special thanks to our moderator, distinguished Professor Joan Williams, who has been wonderful. And just to say, she is a rock star in the legal community and has been a fabulous help to us as she helped us get speakers and she helped organize everything, and she's been so wonderful. And just to let you know, besides being a wonderful professor, she's also, the director of the Center for Work-Life Balance and the UC Hastings Foundation chair. So I just wanted to make sure that she was recognized for that, as well as her upcoming book next year, which is What Works for Women, and 4 patterns and advice that you should know about.
She's one of the true leaders that's helped women in law, and I really want to acknowledge her.
Special thanks.